Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board. It's been a long old while since the last episode, but Norwich City are back in Championship action this weekend when they travel to the Potteries to take on Stoke City. It should be a very interesting one for a number of reasons. Chief among them, of course, the Narcis Pelash factor. Not only is he trying to adopt a new philosophy at Stoke and change the way that they play, he's also coming up against the system that he was trying to improve, the head coach that he was working with as recently as a few weeks ago. So it should be a very interesting one. We'll, of course, cover that. We'll also take a look at the 11 that I think Torop will choose for the game. And we're going to have a bit of a deeper dive into what Angus Gunn's injury absence means for Norwich tactically. All of that to come, but we are going to start, as usual, with the predicted 11. So without further ado, here's the team I think Torop will trust against Stoke. So I've gone for George Long in goal, Kellen Fisher at right back, Shane Duffy and Jose Cordoba at centre back, with Callum Doyle at left back, Kenny McLean, Oscar Schwartau and Anis Ben Slimane in midfield, with Ante Cianats on the right, Borja Sainz on the left and Josh Sargent on his own up front. A couple of decisions in there, of course, to talk about. One of them is in goal, and we will come on to the tactics of that and how it will affect things in terms of the way the game will play out. But just for those who aren't aware of the Angus Gunn injury situation, he's got a side strain, I think was what Torop called it at his pre-match press conference. It sounds like normally he'd be expected to miss another 2 weeks, but they're hopeful injections can have an impact and it won't quite be that long. But for now, he's certainly ruled out of the Stoke game. I'm sure we'll see, and we will of course hear from Torop ahead of the Preston and Middlesbrough games. They'll hope to have him back as soon as possible, but right now not really any alternative other than George Long. And I actually thought he played fairly well against Hull. Maybe on the ball I didn't see many of the improvements that Ben Napper and Torop have talked about in terms of getting used to their style of play, but he did pull off some good saves. There obviously weren't any significant errors, and I think we have seen in a fair few appearances from him that he can make those decent saves, that he can have good afternoons. It's just about developing that consistency and increasing the periods of time between mistakes for him, because of course if you can just have him in for 2 or 3 games at a time and he can be fairly solid for you without making mistakes, yes, you might lose those ball playing capabilities and you might not have someone who's quite as strong tactically as someone like Gunn. But given the fact that he's definitely in the conversation for the best goalkeepers in the Championship, a second choice who's able to do what Long can do at his best isn't really the end of the world. And they'll hope that they can get that George Long rather than the George Long who maybe hasn't endeared himself to Norwich fans at times, but I think does have the potential to do that over a short period of time at least. So I think Norwich have a decent option there, if not a perfect one. If they can get the decent George Long, then they'll be in a fairly good position, even though for the reasons I'm going to come on to later, they would certainly love to have Angus Gunn. The other change I've gone for in there is Oscar Schwartau over Marcelino Nunez. Torop said that it would be fairly touch and go in terms of that hamstring injury that Nunez developed before the international break. Of course, he withdrew from the Chile squad, and the noises we were hearing to start off with were that it could actually be quite a long absence for Nunez, and they could be looking at quite a serious one for him, quite a major concern for the games ahead. So for me, for things to have pivoted that quickly, yes, it does look like they're better than first feared. But for them to pivot that quickly and to have someone who hasn't trained for, I think, 10 or 11 days was what Torop said, and then to immediately chuck them into the starting 11 or back into the starting 11 after that whole performance in the Championship, that feels like it might not quite happen. So it's just a little bit of a hunch. I'm sure if Nunez is 100%, then he'll be in that team, especially given current form. But right now, that feels like a risk that maybe Torop won't take. And then he's got a couple of midfield options. He's got, of course, Amanko Forsen in there. He's got Oscar Schwartau. But when you look at their performances in recent weeks, it feels like Schwartau probably is the logical option. I thought it was a substitute against Hull, albeit against a team that was already beaten. he looked very good, he looked threatening, and not only was he making those runs forward and doing those things off the ball that people have highlighted when they've really specifically watched him, but on the ball there was a bit more of a tangible difference. There was a bit more of him being a creative midfielder, trying to make things happen, rather than some of this off the ball, intelligent, tactical stuff, which of course is very, very helpful. And on this show, you won't have me talking that stuff down. But I think you do need to see a bit of balance because, of course, in such an important role in that possession-based system, you do still want a bit of contribution on the ball and more creative output and attacking output to go alongside those tactical and intelligent interventions that he can make. So I think he's making strides in the right direction. It feels like Forson has struggled a little bit, and although he's a player who I'm sure they still feel they can get the best out of, right now for this team it feels fairly straightforward for me that you would have Schwartau in there, given the fact that the rest of the squad have come back from internationals with no other injuries. The team that did so well against Hull doesn't seem to have been dislodged aside from those two by any fitness issues. I think it would be very difficult for Torup to justify those changes. I think there will be rotation over these next 3 games, but for the first one, it feels like he'll retain as many players as he possibly could from that Hull win, and for that reason, I've only gone for those 2 changes. Now to come on to Stoke, and I think the situation therein actually works in Norwich's favour at the moment. I think everyone knows they're in this sort of period of transition between Steven Schumacher's football and Narcis Pelash's football, but of course Pelash hasn't had a transfer window. He hasn't had many levers to pull in terms of the squad, and right now it feels like there's a little bit of a gap between what they need to be able to play that style of football and what they've currently got in the squad, and that gap is what Norwich will try to exploit this weekend. I think you can see examples of it all over the pitch, to be honest, but I'm going to use the example of the 2 Stoke centre-backs, Ben Gibson and Ben Wilmot, because I think we all know a lot about Ben Gibson, especially after his exploits with Norwich last season, and we all know his qualities as well, because he did, of course, play a very key role in Norwich in the grand scheme of things, coming fairly close to promotion with that playoff semi-final. But he's more of an old school defender. He'll head it and kick it and clear it, and his passing ability is quite good without maybe the athletic ability and the pace that you might need to press high as Pelash will want. It's similar with Wilmot as well, and I think that's where Norwich can exploit things. They like to have space in behind teams. They like to pass it quickly through a press and then almost find themselves in a counter-attacking situation in the opposition half without even being on the counter-attack, and Stoke could play into their hands in that sense, because that is the sort of football that Pelash wants. He has worked under David Wagner, he's worked under Neil Warnock, he's worked under a variety of coaches with a variety of styles, but ultimately, if you take him at his word, and if you take Torup at his word actually, at his pre-match press conference, what Pelash wants is a possession-based, attacking, front-footed style of football that actually isn't too different from what Norwich want, and at the moment it doesn't really feel like they have the players to do that. So if they do try to do that, if they do try to press, which ultimately is a complex tactical system that takes time to learn, then they could find themselves exposed, because if you aren't right on that and if you don't know exactly what to expect, then Norwich do have the players like Jose Cordova, like Callum Doyle, Kenny McLean, a few of those in there really, Kellen Fisher in recent weeks as well. Even Shane Duffy has improved his passing ability, who can just zip the ball around you and find themselves in a really good position if you aren't bang on the money with the press. And right now it still feels like Stoke are learning it, even though they might have a little advantage in that Pelash will know how those ball progressions work, and of course he does have a little bit of insight. So if they go gung-ho and if they go purely ideological and trying to do exactly what Pelash wants with the players that they have against Norwich, I think they could find themselves exposed. However, if they maybe use some of their strengths and be a little bit more pragmatic at the moment until Pelash can make those changes, then I think Norwich could find it difficult, because they have been very good at exploiting that space in behind, at creating it by going through the press. But against sort of low block defences, we haven't seen many chances sort of created in that sense. A very small number of their passes overall are coming in the final third, and that's because they're making those smaller passes, they're working to get through the defence in their own half and then finding themselves in really good positions, as opposed to finding it fairly easy to get out of their own half, which it should be really against a low block defence, and then making lots of passes and moving defenders around to create a shooting opportunity in the opposition half, which could be the situation they find themselves in if Stoke do retreat a little bit and they do play into those strengths of the likes of Gibson and Wilmot, and that slightly older, slightly more old school and physical in maybe a strength sense rather than a pace sense. If they play into those strengths, then that's where Norwich could find themselves against a challenge that maybe they haven't quite overcome as much as others so far this season. So for that reason, I think the first goal will be really important, because of course, if Norwich can score the first goal, then either Stoke will have to bring the game to them and they can just pop it around them, as I explained, and find even further space to go and score more goals, or Stoke will go into that sort of state of retreat and Norwich will absolutely take that, because I think Torup has spoken about defending on the ball a bit more and resting on the ball. And if Stoke are deeper in their own half, then Norwich will happily play it around and control the game and see it out from there. However, if Stoke get the first and then they have the players to sit back and sit on a lead and frustrate Norwich a little bit, then that's where they might find it difficult. So I think the first goal is really, really important. There are plenty of things going in Norwich's favour, but in the negative column, there's the loss of Angus Gunn, which is a big one tactically. And we're going to come on to that and why it is a significant struggle for Norwich, not only on an individual quality level in terms of shot stopping and catching and things like that, but tactically some of the options that it takes away from them. Now, it's rare that you would see an Alisson or Edison-esque long pass from Angus Gunn or anything world-class or sensational of that nature on the ball, but what he does bring is calm. And for someone with such significant ties to the club, who of course will have an emotional connection and plenty of people watching him week in, week out, who are desperate for him to succeed, the calmness with which he distributes the ball without making mistakes is a really vital part of how Norwich build up from the back. Of course, if they had somebody who just lumped long whenever they were under a high press, they wouldn't be able to create those passing sequences in their own half and then leave the space in behind for them to almost counter-attack into, and Gunn really allows them to do that. Now, without him, and with George Long, who's maybe slightly more jumpy and slightly more likely to send the ball long under pressure, that does stifle that ability a little bit. And it is something that Torup and Napper have spoken about. They feel that he's improving in terms of the style of play, but I thought even in that whole game there were still signs that he wasn't quite at the tactical level that Gunn was, and the temperamental level in terms of being able to withstand that pressure, being able to face a striker down 10-15 yards away from your goal and still play that short pass rather than panicking and playing the long ball. And I think tactically that's where losing Gunn is a real major factor for Norwich. Of course, we know about the goalkeeping elements, the shot stopping, the catching under pressure, the box presence that I think has really, really improved in recent seasons as well. But obviously playing the ball out from the back is becoming an increasingly big part of a goalkeeper's arsenal. And ultimately, so much of that is about temperament and mentality rather than technical ability. As I said, the very, very best ones in the world are playing those unbelievable passes that some midfielders couldn't even play. But for almost everyone below that, most professional footballers, even goalkeepers, should be able to play 10-15 yard passes. So it's mainly about mentality. And I think you can see that calmness in Gunn. And not only does he have that, does he have the ability to pass the ball out under pressure, but he also makes very few mistakes in that area as well. So tactically, that's where Norwich will have to be really careful. It's where Long will have to take some risks that, to be honest, he's probably not comfortable with. But if he doesn't take those risks, then Jose Cordoba doesn't get on the ball, Callum Doyle doesn't get on the ball, and those quick passes aren't going to take place to allow Norwich to then make the pitch bigger at the other end of the pitch, make it smaller at their end of the pitch, so that they can create those chances in the opposition half and find that space in the more dangerous areas of the pitch in an offensive sense. So if Long can live up to that, then that'll be fantastic for him, and that'll be very close to a sort of like for like replacement for Gunn. Of course, it will be very difficult for anyone at this level to do that, but ultimately it will be tough because tactically and technically Gunn brings so much. But there are plenty of positives in Norwich's favour. It should be a very interesting clash, and of course we'll have every kick of it covered across our channels. So go to pinkun.com/subscribe and you won't miss any of it. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board. I'll see you again very soon ahead of that Preston clash. Let's hope then I'm talking about 3 points at the Potteries. See you soon.